Some of you may have seen a series of articles that Lizzie and I have written over the past few months summarising some of these changes. But in terms of this session, we propose spending 10 minutes, probably no more, summarising these, and then moving into a broader discussion around these, their impacts, how to plan ahead. So what's happening and why? Well, the why is twofold. The first, HMRC and the Treasury are increasingly concerned at lost revenue through abuse of the system. But equally, they have a key measure which they reference as additionality, which is essentially how much extra is invested in the UK because of a particular incentive. And that's how they measure the efficiency of that incentive. So they have a concern at the moment that too much revenue is being lost through abuse of the system. But equally, they're unconvinced actually around whether additionality is sufficient in the R&D tax regimes. And this may be something we talk about a little bit later in the session. How much is it a nice to have as opposed to a driver for investment in the UK? So that's the first why. The second is it's a fundamental policy shift. So the Treasury have decided that they want to refocus and encourage businesses to buy British and invest in other UK businesses. So that is a very conscious decision of theirs, which is in turn having an impact on the reliefs. So that's the why. If we turn now to the what is happening, and I'm going to let Lizzie talk through the first of these, which is the reintroduction of what we call the PAYE cap.
Thanks, James. So I think initially when this sort of was mooted, it was quite a lot of concern around whether or not there was going to be a really significant impact and how this was harking back to the pre-2012 PAYE cap that had historically been in place. And there was quite a lot of consultation feedback around that. And it seems that HMRC had listened to that feedback and had taken on board the comments that there was going to be concern about the impact for smaller businesses that didn't have so many headcount startup businesses, which I think is particularly pertinent in this sector. So when the detailed guidance actually has been released, was actually quite helpful. So there's a couple of exemptions to that cap if there's two criteria met. The first of which is that there would be an exemption if the company was creating or managing that IP. And an effect of this is that is promoting IP staying in the UK. However, the caveat to that is that that creation and the management of the IP does have to be done by employees of the company. So the bit to be aware of there really is if there are directors that are not employees of the company, there is a risk that you will not meet that exemption. And the second exemption is that actually there should be no more than 15% of the expenditure undertaken by connected parties. So that would make you sort of hit that cap as well. Interestingly, though, actually, when you read into that detail and how the PAYE cap is affected with the own companies PAYE and any connected parties PAYE also being included, the effect of this actually it does not affect too many companies unless they are conducting a lot of that R&D overseas by connected parties overseas. So it's almost acting as a stepping stone to the currently proposed rules that are coming into place for the exclusion of R&D being proposed overseas from 2023. So I think that kind of ties in quite nicely around the overseas restriction, which I think James is going to touch on.
Yeah, and as you say, this brings us to the Buy British changes, as has been referenced. So as a bit of a recap, historically our regime has been designed to give additional relief for qualifying costs incurred by a UK company that's subject to tax in the UK, irrespective of where in the world that money is spent. So think of a laboratory testing in South Korea or a team of chemists in Germany. Provided these were incurred by a UK company in support of its R&D activity, they would have been eligible for relief. From April 2023, relief will not be available for expenditure incurred overseas on subcontracted R&D or payments to workers based outside of the UK. There will be some limited exemptions, and there's one particular that's relevant to the life sciences sector, which is they'll continue to allow relief for payments to clinical trial volunteers. So that continues unaffected. There will be other exemptions which are designed to allow relief for costs incurred out of necessity, not convenience. And that's a direct quote from somebody in the Treasury. Based on particular regulatory requirements or geographical, environmental or population-based restrictions where the conditions simply aren't present in the UK. So we still await the draft legislation, and certainly hasn't been enacted yet. But I would expect, for example, that if you need to undertake trials in the US to get FDA approval, that should fall into the exemption. It's a necessity. But if you choose to subcontract testing to Germany because you know they do a good job, then this is the sort of thing that's likely to be excluded from the relief in the future, because that's in the words of HMRC, that's a convenience, that's a choice rather than something that you're required to do. Personally, I can understand the sentiment, and buy British is great, slightly sort of counterintuitive to our sort of international economy, but I understand the sentiment. What I think's being missed is that it often isn't a conscious choice to buy overseas. It's because the UK doesn't have the expertise. Now, you might counter that this measure is designed to encourage us to develop that expertise in the UK. Again, brilliant, applaud the sentiment, but it's a long-term game. And I think in the shorter term, it's businesses that are going to lose out on the relief, because if there isn't the expertise or the capability in the UK, all they can do is buy overseas. They don't have a choice. And if it doesn't fall into these restricted exemptions, it's simply going to be a cost that stops being eligible. Let's now move on to the third change. Again, Liz is going to talk through some of the enhanced compliance requirements.
So I think, generally speaking, the compliance demands that are in place at the moment are reasonably limited. There's nothing in statute that says what you have to submit with your R&D claims. And I think, generally speaking, the life sciences sector have taken a much more of a light touch approach to this in some areas. Oftentimes because it's quite sort of easy to say that they've met the threshold for that R&D qualification. So there's not always been such a demand to make sure that that is so well documented and included with claims. And with that in mind, I think it's going to be a bit of a step change for a lot of people in this sector to say, well, what is the requisite information that we need to provide to HMRC when we are putting our claims together, and how are we going to go about preparing that? I think we're anticipating that there's going to be some more mandated guidance around what should be included with an R&D change claim. Typically, what we're seeing from an R&D claims perspective, when HMRC are coming back and asking questions, there are three really key areas that they want more clarification on, and those are usually what is the baseline of knowledge and how have you built upon that, and then some real specifics around what are the scientific advances and the scientific uncertainties that have been overcome. And whilst we're waiting for that more detailed guidance, it's likely to be those boxes that are going to need to be ticked. So really speaking around this sector, it's probably not going to be particularly onerous documentation that you're going to have to produce. It's likely that you're going to have a lot of that information within easy reach of your scientists. But it's going to be around how are you going to make sure that what you're doing is compliant? What's the process that you're going to put in place to meet that demand or request from HMRC to supply that documentation? And who's going to go preparing that documentation and pulling all the right information together for you? So it's trying to think about that process, how easy it's going to be, what the demands are going to be on your scientists' time to extract the pertinent information, and put it together in a format that's easily digestible by HMRC. So really, using information that you've got, seeing how you're going to structure that, making sure those boxes are ticked is going to be one of the key things that need to be thought around. I mean, that might well not be only for R&D purposes. You need to kind of think about that from a longer term perspective. When you've got that documented in-house, it's going to be better from a risk perspective when you're looking at any due diligence aspects around fundraising or sale of the information. So it could be two-pronged. It could be helpful in that regard. So it's not all bad news. It's
a really good point, that last one, Lizzie, isn't it? That actually we see sort of in so many senses, the life sciences sector is well ahead of others in terms of sort of how they approach their R&D claims. But so often they fall at that final hurdle of well, of course we're doing R&D. It's obvious we're doing R&D. Look at our website, and you sort of fail in that sort of final submission pack to HMRC, which, considering it's often one of the bigger numbers on the balance sheet, is just sort of one of those things that does stand out when you're looking at diligence or fundraising or any sort of external scrutiny of your numbers. So we've touched on three of the bigger changes here. There are some extra changes that are due to come in, but we thought sort of best to focus today on those of most potential impact. Hopefully it's a helpful summary, albeit sort of a bit of a snapshot. But what we always find is what's more interesting to us is to hear your own thoughts. We've looked at these sort of changes coming in. We've had the chance to speak to HMRC a number of times. We have our own views on sort of potential impact, but as I say, what's often more interesting is to find out from you yourselves. Do these sort of changes cause you concern? Actually, is it really not going to have a huge impact on your business? Have you started to plan or not yet? Those sorts of things, and also I think for yourselves, give you an opportunity to hear from peers in sort of similar businesses or similar sector anyway. So I suppose that sort of finishes our sort of 10-minute kind of summary of talking at you. But we'd love to sort of open the conversation up. Feel free to ask questions either of us or of sort of others within the group. If I can start off, perhaps a broad question of sort of how do you think these changes will impact your claims? I don't know if anybody wants to jump in. Otherwise, there's some friendly faces or familiar faces that I know that I might be tempted to pick on. But does anybody want to jump in and just sort of give us a high level of, is this going to impact your business or not?
Oh, hi, James. It's Marion.
Hi, Marion.
Accession. Well, we've already been talking about, where we're going to be doing certain activities, and because of the potential impact on the R&D claim. So I think it's very much in our minds, yes, to make sure that we can maximise the claim, and it may well feed into decisions which, in my opinion, it shouldn't really. It shouldn't be part of the decision of where you do things. That's my opinion.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And to be honest, I think sort of you and the sort of the management team have done absolutely the right thing. Is that sort of as you're starting to structure this, ask the question that sort of is what we're doing or planning to do going to cause us a problem? And then in turn, we've had the conversation, well, actually it might, but commercially, what is it you want to be doing? And what does the business want to look like in a couple of years' time? And can we try and dovetail sort of the best of both so that actually you've got the right commercial answer, but actually you haven't restricted yourself where you might be able to do something slightly different?
Yeah. It's interesting what you said about the necessity, not convenient point as well, because I think like for a lot of companies, the clear favourite place to do trials is the US because of the FDA approval. So if that's going to be okay, I think that's going to have a massively positive impact on the kind of choices we make.
Yeah, and this is one where we hope to see draft legislation in the next month or so. So at the moment, we're relying really on the sort of anecdotal comment from the policymakers saying that they plan for these exemptions to be quite limited, quite restrictive, and designed around necessity. But exactly how they sort of word that necessity is going to be something that we're going to need to look quite closely at.
Okay. And in terms of the compliance, because I can see a situation where US companies have a little office, a little sort of PO box somewhere in London, which they put on their invoices. Do you think the revenue will be saying, no, where is it physically taking place, this work, or having an invoice with a UK address will be enough, kind of thing?
No, you're absolutely right, and it's something they already do look quite closely at around sort of permanent establishment and sort of all those things around where is actually the taxable presence of the business. But Phil, I know you've got kind of specific expertise here. Is there anything you wanted to chip in on that point?
Well, I think it's the point around HMRC is, they will always check, do you have substance here in the UK? And it's not just in relation to R&D tax credits. It's also, you know, patent box, all those things. They're all designed, all these reliefs are designed such that if you are just a PO box, you ought not to be benefiting from them. I am sure that there are some that are maybe slipping through the cracks, but not ones that we're aware of or that we're advising.
I mean, we're not, but I mean, if you had a supplier who has a UK presence, shall we say, but really everything they do is based elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's the point that James and Lizzie were talking through. It is that, you know, this is trying to counteract those situations where that is happening.
Yeah.
You know, will it work? I think it probably will. But you know, I think the other thing that I've heard, and maybe James and Lizzie can correct me on, is that HMRC have moved quite a lot of staff over to the R&D team in order to try and, should we say, police what's going on. Was it sort of 50 or 60 people in the last 12 months, or am I making that up?
No, it's certainly close. So I think the number billed is close to 100, but I think that number is probably 12 months old. So they did really bolster their teams 12 months ago. And what we saw was sort of a lot of those 100 were rookies that sort of could just about spell R&D, but really didn't have the training. And so we got sort of a spate of these very generic inquiries coming through. They're now starting to get to the point where they've got more of a skill set, more of an understanding. But we are seeing a lot of inquiry letters coming through, and they're inquiry letters for businesses that are, to my point earlier, they're obviously doing R&D. You Google them and you can see that they are sort of tech businesses, they're life sciences businesses, they're clearly doing R&D. They are getting picked on.
And I think also to Marion's point, I think one of the other interesting things around this is that we will have to be fleshing out as this progresses is, to what extent do you have any control over where your subcontractors are actually conducting the R&D on your behalf? So, or do you have the influence of them, or the visibility on the activities and where those activities are being conducted? So it's not necessarily in every company's commercial interest to keep that work onshore, if they can offshore some of that work and still provide you with the same product and the same quality of service. So at what level do you have to kind of disclose that and drill down into what is going on?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Thank you, Marion, for going first. There always has to be one.
Okay.
But thank you for that. Go on, Graham. Sorry, I interrupted.
Morning, everyone. Hi, just adding on to that. I mean, James, are you seeing clients, are they starting to change business models? Are they you touched on it before. One doesn't want the tax wagging the commercial dog, but it's got to be taken into consideration, hasn't it? And what are we seeing so far?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's early stages, but probably all of the conversations I've had so far, it has been a case of, no, of course we're not going to change our business model. We have a trusted lab out in Germany that we've used for the last 10 years. We're not going to change that for the sake of this. We'll just accept that our R&D credit goes down. So I suppose that's the sentiment I've seen. But this is one of those areas I'd love to hear from some of you on the call. Sort of, what's your sentiment? Would it actually drive decisions? Maybe not immediately, so maybe not from April 23 would you change your supplier, but will you think sort of a couple of years down the line, maybe we could transition to a UK-based supplier to sort of re-access that relief? Oh, Richard.
Hi, yeah, a couple of questions. One building on the point you mentioned earlier. So, I mean, if we're 3 years into a clinical, if we've got a 3-year clinical trial and we've only just started it recently, it's not going to be very practical to change suppliers midway through that income stream. So that's not really going to make a lot of difference to what we're doing in that respect. If those CROs have a UK entity, but the trial's conducted in the US, building on Mariam's point, I think it was, would that then would we then be able to use the necessity not convenience aspect of the rule in that it's a US-based trial, but we're using effectively a UK supplier or even a US supplier if that were the case?
Yeah, very good question. So if I take the first question first, which I think is sort of around that grandfathering principle that you mentioned, clinical trials, which again, some of those costs are ring fenced and were sort of kept out of these exclusions. But a broader principle of that grandfathering, that where you've got an existing contract, will it stop qualifying from April 23, or will you be allowed to sort of continue, but for any future contracts are restricted? So we asked this very question of the guys in the policy team a couple of weeks ago, and they said there will be no grandfathering. It's too complicated. And we made exactly that point. You're saying, look, you've got less than 12 months to plan for this. It's too short a time for businesses. And they said, no, it's been coming for years. People have known about it. It's plenty of time. Too complicated. So unfortunately, there won't be that grandfathering. It will be a change from April 23. To your second point around the sort of the structuring of the CROs and where you have to use a particular CRO, or it has to be in a particular territory, you would hope, but it's going to be one of those things where we're going to have to wait to see the detail. What I would see, and Lizzie and I've seen this over the last couple of months, HMRC have been very receptive to the lobbying that we've been doing. So they released a draft of their intentions back in October time last year, inviting feedback. We went back and said, look, these blanket exclusions of overseas costs are just too punitive. They then came back very quickly within sort of a couple of months in January, February time with these lists of exemptions and sort of exclusions for certain costs. So they have been willing to tailor what they're doing to sort of genuine commercial requirements. So we would hope it is probably as best as we can say until we see that draft legislation.
Okay, and then I guess my second question was the April 2023 rule. Is that for the overseas aspect? Does that apply to years commencing or for tax years?
As far as we can tell, it would be costs incurred after.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Graham, go for it.
James, just as a question from Shura from London and Partners in the chat box, how do you think this will impact attracting international businesses setting up in the UK?
It's a good question, and I suppose sort of maybe a slight side commentary around sort of how this compares to other regimes, because I think we're very conditioned to the UK regime, and to us this is a restriction. Whereas actually, if you compare it to some other territories, you get a slightly different picture. So, for example, Australia already has a territorial based sort of basis of claim, so you have to incur the costs in territory for it to be eligible. US has, for as long as I can remember, sort of had a similar basis where it has to be in territory for it to be eligible. So when you look at some of those examples, you think, wow, actually maybe the UK was too generous to allow sort of costs anywhere in the world, so long as they sit in a UK P&L. And this plays again to sort of one of the drivers behind this from HMRC's perspective, which is they don't want to see IP businesses rewarded for leaking IP overseas. They want as much of that IP to benefit the UK. So, I mean, our counter is how much IP is leaking if you're using a laboratory in Germany because your IP sits in the UK. But their intention is actually, they're saying, well, actually, there is a leakage there. We want to be training a UK laboratory and sort of bringing all of that expertise into the UK. So I suppose within that context, will it impact decisions? Possibly. But I think in this sense alone, sort of around the territorial basis, the UK was always quite generous in how it was structured. And I think you find a number of other territories around the world are already on a territorial basis. Albeit you could counter and say, well, look, if you're going to make it a territorial basis, then the rate needs to go up. The value sort of needs to go up to compensate.
I think there's going to be other factors coming into play, isn't there, from a wider tax perspective when we're thinking about the changes that are being coming in with the tax rate that's going up significantly. So maybe the R&D becomes less of the concern, and some of the wider tax policy has a more impact on where companies are choosing to locate their business.
Yeah, very much so. Phil, I don't know if you've got kind of a view on any of that around sort of where businesses choose to locate.
I think at present, I mean, I'm just thinking through conversations I've had over the last few months. Clients are still looking at setting up in the UK because, yes, the tax rate is going up, but it's more the commercial driver of access to markets, albeit the funding tap is slightly not the same as it was. They are still looking at that in that context. So I think, rightly so, it's still the commercial side of it is driving decision, not necessarily the tax side of it. But it's clearly always a factor. I think, Lizzie, you're probably right. The coming to the UK to take advantage of the R&D regime is perhaps still an agenda item, but it's not top of the list. But we still have a very favourable patent box regime, so people are still looking at it in that context.
I was going to say, have we got any other questions? Oh, Marion again.
Sorry, me again. You just mentioned patent box. Can we see any changes coming down the line for that regime?
So interestingly not so far, because I mean the obvious example is that sort of we've got a corporate tax rate going from 19 to 25%. Patent box is worth 10. It's suddenly so much more attractive from next year. But I think I suspect it's almost a conscious choice that actually patent box is still quite underused. So you look at some of the statistics around businesses that are taking up the patent box and the amount that it's costing the Exchequer to sort of support patent box, and it's less than they were expecting. There's a very few number of businesses that are claiming it. Now, agreed, some of those businesses are very large businesses and benefiting to quite a significant extent, but the uptake still hasn't, I think, been anywhere near sort of the uptake that R&D tax credits has had sort of after, I don't know, sort of five years of being in place. So I don't think, I certainly haven't heard any rumours around any more changes. We've already had a round of changes to sort of deal with, which came into place summer last year, which makes it slightly more restrictive around sort of record keeping and track and trace and some of those areas around sort of impacts of structures. But no, fortunately not. And actually, it's a really good point that I think Phil and Lizzie both made. Actually, a 10% tax rate on qualifying sort of profits from qualifying IP is still really attractive when you look at sort of other territories around the world.
Yeah, so does that kind of interact well with the R&D tax claim of keeping things sort of British and then becoming qualifying IP for the patent box regime?
It does, and they've always had half an eye to sort of making the two regimes complementary. So some of those changes that were introduced over the past couple of years is around exactly that, is sort of punishing is the wrong word, but limiting relief where you have what they call bad R&D, which is R&D that sits overseas, and sort of by contrast, sort of incentivizing the R&D to sit in the UK.
Yeah, and I guess the stuff that's affected by patent box is sort of almost by definition good IP because it's making a profit.
Well, exactly, but it's a very good point that sort of a lot of businesses sort of fall at the first hurdle where sort of patent box sounds really attractive, but you need to be making profits to access a lower rate of tax. And this is something that sort of early stage life sciences businesses are often sort of a few years out from whilst they're sort of in that intensive R&D phase.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
James, I'll just throw in another, hopefully not a curveball. In terms of, you mentioned about the number of people, the revenue you've taken on from an R&D point of view. Are you seeing you've been seeing a tightening, and in terms of what are companies needing to do? Is it more documentation? Is this going to exacerbate through the new legislation?
Yeah, so there's quite a mix. So there's a lot of inquiries that are sort of computer generated, where you have this sort of slightly absurd circumstance where you've gone to the trouble of submitting a report, they've ignored it, the computer's randomly selected you for inquiry, they send a sort of a 4-page inquiry letter. You can usually knock those back quite quickly with a sort of a polite, have you read what we've already sent you? But actually they are also getting their teeth into quite a few issues. So software, probably not necessarily a huge area of concern for life sciences businesses, but software development is a real area of focus, has been for a number of years, and they really do get their teeth into is it R&D? Is it sufficiently innovative? I think sort of generally speaking, where you're well, I think for the sector that we're talking about today, it's a much easier explanation of whether it is R&D or not. But they are also genuinely looking at the eligibility of costs. And this plays back to the point that Lizzie was making, which is if you approach it with that attitude of, well, of course it's R&D, then actually you often fall at that second part, which is, do you have a qualifying cost? And we had this instance, or a client that we recently took on, where actually they'd been claiming very significant tax credits, but you looked at it and they were a large business and they were subcontracting all of their R&D to an overseas territory to carry it out on their behalf. And as a large business, subcontracted R&D doesn't qualify. So you looked at it and it was absolutely nailed on R&D, what they were doing. It just hadn't been structured right. And the claim sort of was turned into 10% of what it was. It was a very significant 7-figure change to benefit, because it wasn't a qualifying cost. And this is so often a frustration that we see, because it is R&D. But if it's not in one of those buckets of staff costs, consumables, contributions to clinical trial volunteers, those sorts of things, that it just doesn't qualify.
I think, and oftentimes when you're seeing, that inquiries do come in and they find a couple of areas that have been erroneously included, then they start to get a little bit more interested in other aspects of the claim. So it does sometimes kind of roll in from that making sure you've got all the basics right in the first time round will alleviate some of the further questioning and concerns that could ensue.
It's a really good point, and you can also, we all have our own opinions over why that is, whether it's sort of almost a face saving that once you've opened an inquiry you need to find something, so you keep looking until you do, or something more genuine, you don't know. But we had exactly that, where we had an inquiry which really picked away at, is it R&D? And we got through that and they came back and said, yeah, happy it's 100% of the claims R&D. Oh, but by the way, we don't think that the intercompany agreement that you've got in place is supportive of an externally provided worker arrangement. We think it's subcontract, so we think the whole claim's out for that. And you do see them taking these tangents as well. And that one in particular, again, highlighted documentation, that this business was relying on a sort of a 2014 fairly generic transfer pricing-esque sort of intercompany agreement, which just wasn't representative of what those two businesses in the group were doing. And it was really unhelpful for the R&D claim. And it was also, it genuinely wasn't the reality of the situation. The intercompany relationship had evolved over those last sort of 8 years, but the documentation hadn't. It does come back to that point that we often find that sort of talking about intercompany agreements, transfer pricing can be sort of maybe one of the, you might say, the drier end of tax, but it's so important to revisit some of this stuff and just make sure that it is genuinely representing the commercial reality.
Thanks, James. Lizzie, just to follow up on the PAYE cap, what do you see that having an impact on? I mean, I can remember when it was originally in, when it first came in. Yes, I am that old, but
and I think that was the fear. I think the fear was we're going to be going back to this sort of quite restrictive cap. And when sort of it was first mooted, I think there really was that concern that we were going to be companies that were kind of on their uptick, that didn't have a lot of employees, that were subcontracting, getting support for that R&D, were going to be hugely affected by this. And as James said, there's been that consultation, there's been that discussion, there's been the listening from HMRC to the impact this is going to have on the businesses that they're actually trying to support, and they're genuinely trying to support those companies. And they've managed to kind of say, actually, well, we're going to put some exceptions into that. And on the face of it, I think the majority of companies are not going to get impacted by the PAYE cap. Even if you have you have connected parties that are doing that work, because you can include their PAYE in your calculation of the cap. What it really seems to be targeting are companies that have a lot of connected parties overseas. So it's a really pseudo overseas exclusion coming in that little bit 2 years earlier, to target that specific behaviour of pushing that work overseas to connected parties, specifically connected parties. And it was sort of seen to be some tackling some abuse and some fraudulent activity to do that. So unless you have that specific fact pattern with a lot of overseas connected parties doing that work, it's unlikely to impact companies' claims. Which is.
Thanks, Lizzie. No, just pause to see if there's any more questions from the audience. If not, I've got one or two up my sleeve. They're all thinking about it. I mean, James, what do you consider? What should be companies be doing now, planning for it? I know it's come in place. It's coming. You know, what are we recommending companies do?
It's exactly that. It's thinking about it. It's planning for it. And I think I don't know. Sort of some people might say, sort of, you might think this morning, sort of, well, why are we being picked on as a sector? Well, I don't think you are. I think sort of some of the issues that we've talked about today could very well have an impact on the sector, but equally, I think some of those exemptions play very neatly to the life sciences sector. So the examples we've given, you have to do trials in the US to get that FDA approval. So I think it's a case of planning. It's thinking. Is there anything that's going to impact us? It's then sort of, these are the conversations we're having with a number of businesses at the moment. Is, well, what do you want to do about it? So let's quantify the impact. Does my claim go down by 25% or something? Can I live with that? Or actually, does that prompt me to really rethink how I'm structuring my business, if indeed I can restructure my business for how it's set up? But that starting point is just knowing what's coming and being ready for it.
Any good news?
Yeah, it's I know we're always wary. Sort of, you want these sessions to be upbeat, and I think we've talked about changes, and I think rightly we put this session together because when you bundle them together, there's some quite significant changes coming down the track, and particularly that Buy British sort of change is, by their own admission, it's the most fundamental policy shift since the introduction of the regime. But notwithstanding that, the Treasury and HMRC are still genuinely supportive of R&D tax credits. They genuinely want to encourage UK business. We come back to that additionality concept. They want to encourage extra investment in the UK. And to do that, they want the R&D tax credits to work as well as possible. And you see that in some of the engagement that we have with the policy teams and the sort of the senior level guys. They want this to work. They invited us and sort of a number of other agents to one of their new offices in Birmingham a couple of weeks ago for exactly that purpose. They're saying, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this? Does this work? Does this not work? What do we need to change? And they were genuinely receptive of it. And the things that they want to stamp out, and I think we would all be supportive of this, is that they want to stop funding companies that are abusing the regime. The problem is there's always collateral, and it's that old sort of adage of the innocent are easier to catch. It's so the more compliant are the ones that sometimes get tangled in these changes, and that's certainly the case. But I think overwhelmingly they are still supportive. This is still a generous regime, but I suppose it leads me on to a question really around that additionality piece. And I don't know if we can just do a straw poll sort of show of hands around that. Is our R&D credits a nice to have, or do they actually influence investment decisions? So maybe let's start with that first one. Sort of how many on the call today sort of see R&D credits as a nice to have? That's interesting. And in contrast, so how many people on the call would say that the R&D, the access to R&D credits in the UK is a genuine sort of influencer of investment decisions? That's interesting. So the latter has it, and actually that's probably the first time I've asked the question and had that answer. A lot of people will say that. So look, the fact that you potentially get the relief 15 months, as much as 24 months after you've spent the money, the rate's good, but could be better. A lot of those things sort of people say that actually it's great. I mean, we'd love to sort of keep getting hold of it, but it's not encouraging us to spend more. Whereas actually it seems that well, maybe the group that we've got today have a different view. I don't know if anybody wants to elaborate on sort of their thoughts there, or if not, we can carry on.
And then with that in mind, then if we're seeing the R&D funding is kind of making that difference in terms of sort of the compliance and that sort of additional impact that might have on putting together some compliant claims, do you feel as group putting together claims that is going to be burdensome, and how do you think you might become able to overcome that? Or are you all putting together documentation anyway?
I think people are trying to find the thumbs up message. Just Phil has raised a point in the chat. He asks for a CFO for a number of VC-backed early stage companies, and they obviously know where the science is best. So there is obviously potentially a funding gap. Ask the question about how aware of the investor community. I mean, I suppose this is part of our challenge, isn't it? Is about making sure that it's not just a tax issue. This is an overall funding point, and therefore the message needs to get out. There's a couple of responses. I mean, interestingly enough, Phil, sure, in terms of Innovate UK, I think the grant funding, you're right, is actually appears to be too variable, and also the way it's structured at the moment, I'm finding is actually it's pretty narrow and very competitive, and also has an impact obviously on your R&D. Which actually I find sometimes, when early stage companies are going for grant funding, if you structure it right, you can actually get the best of all worlds.
Yeah, I think there's some really good points, and just before we come to Laragh, I suppose, yes, sort of grant funding is that big. Well, can't grant funding fill the gap? And yes, you would hope it could. And I know sort of years and years ago when I think one of the general elections where Labour was sort of coming around canvassing opinion of some of the advisor community, and they're saying, we'll just get rid of R&D tax credits, we'll just replace it with grant funding. Works much better, much more specific, much quicker. And you sort of looked at them in horror, because I suppose our experience is that grant funding absolutely has a place, but we all know it's time consuming to apply for. Many of these grants require sort of audits, which again, time consuming, costly. There's only so much bandwidth within businesses to sort of go around hunting for these grants. They are very specific. Sometimes you won't get the first one, and you find sometimes that kind of, I suppose, grant fatigue in businesses. They just get to the point where just haven't got time to keep looking for a grant that might suit me and I might be able to access. I suppose in that sense, the R&D tax credit regime does look a lot sort of simpler and easier to comply with. And Graham, very, very valid point around sort of they're not sort of comfy bedfellows, sort of grants and R&D tax credits. Almost all Innovate UK grants will have an impact on an SME R&D tax credit claim, for example, and you wonder why that's the case, and it comes down to sort of EU competition law, but it doesn't seem right that sort of a fairly small Innovate UK voucher, for example, can actually wipe out an entire project from being eligible for SME tax credit claims. And again, if businesses are sort of aware of this early on, then you make the right decision. Is the grant more valuable than the R&D tax credit? In which case you go for the right one. But so often you come at it sort of when you're doing the tax comps 18 months later, suddenly you find that you've got a problem that you really wish you hadn't. Sorry, Laragh, go on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to come in, obviously, when you asked the question, James, about R&D tax credits are nice to have or sort of key for investment. I mean, obviously, I've worked with a lot of startup companies in my career, and the R&D tax credit has been an essential part of just keeping that company alive. So I think it's more than a nice to have. And I guess, obviously, with these changes coming in for a lot of early stage companies, they're in that cycle of dependent on the R&D tax credit to make them viable. So there's an interaction there with the going concern assumption and cash and the runway, obviously, that they've got, which I think is Phil's point about, if there's going to be, I guess, pressures on being able to access R&D tax credits or reducing the claims, then investors need to be aware, because I think it was sort of a given that if you submitted your claim, you know, and you got the tax credit the first year, that you were pretty much guaranteed it following years. Obviously, these changes, as you said rightly, every year you should review the claim and your qualifying costs going in. But I would suggest in the past that hasn't been as much scrutiny as you're suggesting there may be now. So it's just interesting, I think, that dynamic, particularly for early stage companies, that they have become very dependent on the tax credit as sort of guaranteed cash to help them fund their activities, which could be put under pressure going forwards.
Just conscious, we've got Richard.
Yeah, I know, because we're listed in the US as well as on AIM on NASDAQ, and we get a lot of questions from US investors about the guaranteed aspect of the R&D tax credits in terms of the funding requirements of the company. So yeah, it is I would say it is more of a fundamental point for us to some degree. So yeah, just not make that comment. That's it.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's always an interesting. I'm not sure whether you're sort of SME or RDEC, but you then get into that sort of tightrope, I suppose, where you need to be sort of clear that the access to the RDEC is not affecting your going concern, but it is still very important to sort of the cash flow of the business, and articulating that in the right way to auditors and all sorts.
Okay, we've still got 10 minutes left, but I won't stretch it straight to the 10 minutes, just to I'm picking up on that, James, what Richard mentioned about the different jurisdictions. We've obviously, you touched on it early on, and interestingly enough, it sounds as though we're moving more into line with other jurisdictions. Are we still seeing an R&D tax credit arbitrage between countries?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we obviously talk a lot with sort of our counterparts across the international network and around sort of what they're seeing in each of their territories. And right, there are a lot of territorial based incentives already, which makes us look actually sort of quite generous, albeit some of the rates are higher in other territories and lower in other territories. In terms of an arbitrage, we sometimes, I suppose, when we most often get the question is coming in from the US saying, we want to do R&D in Europe, where should we do it? Where are we best doing it? And then you start to think about sort of whether it's Germany, whether it's France, whether it's the UK. But you still very quickly get past the R&D tax credits and through to sort of points that Phil, I think, mentioned already. It's actually its access to markets, its expertise, its ability to do business in a territory that kind of often acts as I suppose the priority, and for all those reasons the UK is still very attractive. Phil, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one thing, I know Lizzie and I have seen this in recent discussions with companies is, and excuse me, I've got a cold, which is why I think it's slightly croaky. I think it particularly, you know, as we've heard on this call, there are UK life science businesses that will look at the US market because of the FDA approval, because of the size of a potential future market, and it's that debate over, do we continue to grow our business in the UK, or do we almost up sticks and move stuff to the US and start to grow our business in the US? And I know I've seen businesses that will look at almost getting to the decision point of, okay, we've got IP in the UK, but do we start creating IP in the US as well? And that's almost becoming a live debate because of these potential changes, where you haven't got as much benefit of the UK R&D tax credit. Well, there is a regime in the US. It's not as beneficial. But do we start to think about having a critical mass of people in the US, and do we accept that we've got a split of IP between the UK and the US? And I think that those sort of discussions are becoming more common, with these sorts of changes. I don't know whether anyone on the call has experienced that themselves, but it's certainly something that I've seen more of over the last couple of years than I've ever seen before. The prospect of a UK company setting up and having IP in the US has never ever been talked about before until recently.
Okay, is there any other queries? Just again, conscious of time, and Laura's already given everyone half an hour back. If there isn't any other queries, James, Lizzie, do you want to, and Phil, do you want to actually summarise, or is there any closing comments before we close?
Lizzie, do you want to go first? Oh, on mute.
Sorry. I think what's going to be key, I guess, for companies is to think about reviewing their existing processes, looking at the impacts of those processes, and seeing how they're going to be taking you forward for the next stage of your R&D claims compliance, particularly making sure that you've got streamlined access to those, so you can put that all in place to get your submissions in at the earliest opportunity, and making it into a robust and repeatable process that has as little impact on your day-to-day business as possible.
Thanks, Lizzie.
And to be honest, Lizzie, I think that for me, that would be the biggest, I hate the word, but the biggest takeaway is actually that it's quite an easy fix to just get your documentation sorted when you don't have HMRC breathing down your neck. When they go and open their inquiry and you're on the back foot slightly, it's just more expensive, it's more time consuming, it's just not as much fun, I suppose. But to the other points, I think we've mentioned it a couple of times, it's just plan ahead. So more than happy, as you'd expect, to sort of be involved in those conversations with you, thinking about, look at your current R&D claim. If you were making that claim next year, what's in, what's out? How much of an impact does that make on your cash flow? Is that something you can live with? Is that something that with some tweaks that you can live with commercially, could we make the impact slightly more favourable? Those are the sorts of conversations that we should be starting to have now, and certainly when we've got the draft legislation in the next month or so, and we can see some of the definitions behind sort of the necessity and the exemptions, starting to work it into cash flows, so that none of this is a surprise when it hits, would be my closing points.
And I think for me, just it was touched on earlier, there's a kind of transfer pricing angle to some of this, and to go back and look at what you're doing, what you have been doing historically, and think about, is it up to task? Does it need to be reviewed in the context of the potential business changes that you might be making, just so that you're not suddenly finding that what you think you're going to get in, and as James says, what's in and what's out, is actually out because your transfer pricing hasn't been sorted.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, James. Thanks, Lizzie. I think we're probably coming to a close now. Without saying, I should actually say it, I mean, do talk to your advisors, and of course, as James has actually said, do feel free to come and talk to us. We will send round contact details after this this session, but we really appreciate you all coming on and sharing some of your thoughts. Thanks again to all our panel this morning, and I'm going to try and do a round of applause. There we go. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll catch up soon. Thanks very much.